Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 42 and 43. Let's begin. It's a warehouse. Tsukauchi rubbed his forehead and nodded, even though the officer couldn't see it through his phone. Thanks for checking, Officer Tancho, he told them before hanging up. He made a mark on the tablet and shook his head. It was a bust. He scrolled through his contacts, and hit dial on the right one. He knew they'd be working for the same reason he was. To keep his mind off what was happening in the hospital. Toshinori had been in and out of surgery several times already and there were more to come. The emergency surgery was still ongoing. It was only interrupted so that they could pump him full of drugs and liquid and so that the surgeons could take a break. 28 hours on and the situation was as grim as ever. The phone connected. What is it, detective? We can't find Izuku, he told the sidekick. I'm sore. No, Tsukauchi interrupted the apology. You're not. If you had any interest in finding the kid, you would have let us go after him yesterday. He growled. He was so frustrated. They knew where Izuku was. He'd been at school. The school themselves confirmed it. He'd gone home as usual and this morning, he just hadn't shown up. There was no explanation for that. They had given him Izuku's home address. The new one, and the one they had registered from his first enrollment. Both came up empty. The phone numbers were also not being answered. We could not risk all for one suspecting anything. Mirai retorted, sounding tired. We wouldn't have gone for him in the morning. Naomasa growled back. The sidekick knew that. We would have gone during your operation, or just after it. Then we would have Izuku. The police weren't about to interrupt the number one hero's mission, but there were chances to get both missions completed. I understand your desire to solve this case, but capturing All for One was more important. Sir Nightai still had the gall to attempt to sound reasonable. You do not. Tsukauchi snapped. The sidekick did not understand his desire. The sidekick thought nothing of Izuku and even less of Inko. He thought she was some stupid woman for getting involved with All for One. He knew it wasn't like that. She couldn't lie to him and every word she said told him just how much she'd been betrayed. The kid should be at home or returning to school. Pick him up from there, Sir Nightai told him. Tsukauchi forced himself to take a deep breath before replying. The home addresses were fake, he told the sidekick through clenched teeth. And he hasn't come to school today. He couldn't help the hiss that escaped with the statement. What am I going to tell his mother? He asked the question. You tell her nothing, Sir Nightai replied immediately. Naomasa could hear his disbelief that he had the gall to even suggest that they tell Inko Midoriya anything. She is involved in this case. 5 years ago she was involved. Not anymore, Sir Nightai was matter of fact when he made that announcement. Tsukauchi stared at his phone for a few moments, not believing what he was hearing. Izuku is her son, he said softly. How did the sidekick not believe that Inko was involved? No mother ever forgot her children. She is no longer involved, All Might's sidekick repeated. Naomasa trembled slightly. He sighed heavily. It's going down in my report that your obstruction caused us to miss getting the child back. We got All for One. One child, a villain's child is no price at all to pay for that. Tsukauchi gritted his teeth. Sir Nightai didn't care and it wasn't we who got All for One, it was Toshinori. Sir Nightai might have found the man's location but that was his job and when you broke it down, almost any sufficiently skilled analyst could have found him, if they had the details of the case. Naomasa knew why Yagi didn't want the details getting out but it was Toshinori who had taken out All for One, and it was Toshinori who was in the hospital paying the direct price. But people like Inko were paying the indirect price and their pain was not to be discounted. He took a deep, shuddering breath. You'd better hope that you haven't created the next supervillain, Tsukauchi told Sir Nightai before he hung up. Izuku was only 9 but he had spent 5 years with his father, and if his current school was to be believed, he wasn't quirkless. They said they had seen fire breath several times. It didn't sound like such a dangerous quirk but Naomasa couldn't dismiss it. Izuku was All for One's son, who knew what other aspects of his quirk fire breath was hiding. After all, there had to be a reason All for One had taken his son. He prayed they didn't find out the hard way. Kurogiri had deposited them back in the kitchen. He'd also given Tomura a credit card and instructions to order them something more nutritious for dinner than cup noodles. The Misty Man hadn't said a thing beyond that about their dinner choice last night. Then he had left. Izuku had looked at Tomura and Tomura had looked at him, and for once, neither of them said anything. Izuku moved to sit at the table. He felt sick, but he didn't want to be alone. His mind kept seeing his dad, floating in that liquid, with tubes and a mask obscuring his face but not hiding the fact that it wasn't there. Tomura snarled. His red eyes seemed to glow. Heroes did that, he spat. The green-haired boy nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't want to cry again. You love heroes. Tomura continued. There was something in his tone that warned Izuku, and his green eyes flew to the teen. This is your fault. Tomura screamed, his hand extended as he lunged. Izuku dodged, but the table wasn't so lucky. It disintegrated into dust before his eyes. The soy sauce bottle fell to the ground and rolled around. His chair fell over too. Something coalesced within him though with the movement. The worry, the fear, the grief, the sick feeling, it all collapsed. It's not my fault. Izuku screamed back. For an instant the white-haired teen looked surprised, but then red eyes narrowed again. You love heroes. No, I don't. Not anymore. He didn't. Not when he'd seen the type of people who became heroes. Not when he'd see that society wanted that. Not when he'd felt that with every injustice he'd experienced because he supposedly had no quirk, or a weak one. Not when he'd seen what those who had odd quirks went through. Not when they'd hurt his dad. You do. Tomura screeched, and lunged again. Hands out, ready to grasp Izuku. He was better prepared this time. The green-haired boy leapt back, over his chair, and simultaneously pushed at Tomura with his quirk. His aim was a little off because he pushed the chair into Tomura's legs. The older boy fell, tumbling over the chair to hit the floor with both hands. It began disintegrating immediately, but even angry, Tomura realized that the kitchen floor was on the second story. He needed that floor. He pulled his hands up immediately. Except the disintegration spread. As Izuku watched, the tiles disappeared with small puffs of dust and the floorboards beneath were exposed. There was a moment where it looked like decay wouldn't go further, and then the wood began curling back before disappearing into dust. Izuku activated his quirk, making himself lighter and hardening the air to support himself. Shit! Tomura swore as he backed away. Izuku saw he wasn't going to be fast enough and dived in. He grabbed the older boy under his armpits and hauled him upwards. The weight was a strain, but Izuku reminded himself he had picked up heavier things. He'd never tried to make them fly with him though. The floor kept receding, but decay seemed to be slowing down. There were pipes under the boards and Izuku could see a concrete base. Get us out of here! Tomura yelled. Izuku hesitated. Move! Tomura screamed. It's okay, the green-haired boy told the teen, as he looked at the concrete. It was not decaying. He dropped Tomura as gently as he could. The white-haired boy landed with a thump onto the concrete and experimentally tapped it with his foot. It held. The wood continued to disintegrate and there was a groan. Izuku spun mid-air, trying to find it but couldn't, and his search was interrupted by a loud thud that actually shook the concrete slightly. The source of that noise was easier to find. The fridge wobbled. Instinctively Izuku sent a plane of air towards it, holding it upright. That steadied it but exhausted him and he dropped to the concrete next to Tomura. Tentatively he released the hold on the fridge and was relieved when it remained upright. They surveyed the damage. There was a gap between the cupboards and the concrete all around the kitchen now, and the door. The chairs were mostly fine, but the table was dust along with the tiles and wooden floor, and there were pipes running over the floor. But everything was holding, and that was good. Izuku took a deep breath and turned back to Tomura. I do not want to be a hero, he told the teen seriously. You used to. Tomura retorted. He couldn't deny that, so he nodded. Back when I thought heroes were good and helped people. Izuku explained. Not now. Tomura took a deep breath and eventually nodded. At least you learned that, he muttered. Izuku nodded seriously again, and then a puff of dust caused him to sneeze. And that broke the tension, but it let the sick fear he had been feeling back in. He slid down, sitting on the concrete, despite the dust. Daddy has always said he needs both of us, the freckled boy whispered, looking down as he fought tears. Tomura nodded this time. Izuku bit one lip gently. It gave him something else to focus on. Then I think we should help each other, he said softly. The teen considered it. Izuku wasn't looking at him, but he could feel Tomura turning the words over in his head, trying to find the catch, trying to find out any hidden meaning. There was none. Dad was gravely injured, and while Dad wasn't Tomura's father, Izuku knew the teen thought more than fondly of him. For Dad, they shouldn't fight each other. Okay, Tomura agreed. But if you go back to liking heroes, he added with a growl. There was no need to specify any consequence. I won't, Izuku said firmly, rising. He looked up and met Tomura's red eyes. I won't, he repeated belligerently. He meant it. His dad was. He didn't want to think about it. There was no way he was going to like heroes ever again. He held out his hand. He'd seen Dad do this when he went to work with him. It was a way of sealing deals. Tomura looked at him for a moment before he gave one sharp nod and then turned to one of the drawers. Izuku felt a stab of disappointment before he saw Tomura pull out one of his gloves. He didn't know Kurogiri kept a pair there. Tomura slipped it on and took Izuku's hand. They shook once and Izuku felt that something between them had fundamentally changed. He gave a wobbly smile. I didn't know your quirk could do that, he commented as they parted. Do what? Tomura asked, looking around. They were both at a bit of a loss as to what to do now. Izuku frowned. He wasn't sure how to explain. When you disintegrated stuff in the past, you've only ever dusted that object. He said. Like my t-shirts, he added. He had more than enough experience there. Tomura gave him a wicked grin but nodded. He had the same memories, or almost the same. This time you touched the floor and the tiles got dusted, but so did the wood. It was enough of an observation for Tomura to realize what he was talking about. Ha! He said, as he brought up one of his hands to stare at it like it was something new. I didn't know I could do that, Izuku heard him say. He grinned but the expression immediately faltered. Did you change focus? Did you want to get rid of the floor? Did you think about it? Or did you just push decay out? He asked the questions. Red eyes gave him a disbelieving look. I was trying to get you, he pointed out. Oh yeah, Izuku muttered. He let it drop and for a few moments just breathed. He knew what he should suggest. They should clean up the dust from the tiles and floorboards, but that was such a regular reaction that he couldn't focus on it. I want to help Daddy, he whispered. You heard the doctor, Tomura reminded him. Kurogiri is bringing in healers, he added. Izuku nodded and sighed. But healing quirks are rare, he replied, remembering what Dr. Garaki had told them. And, are they really that good? He asked. Most of the games Tomura played had someone with a healing quirk in them, but there always seemed to be a price and it wasn't always money. The teen didn't answer and Izuku looked at him. Tomura looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. One he really didn't like. The really good ones are but tch. But what? They're controlled by the fucking heroes, Tomura finished. Izuku felt his stomach drop again. That didn't seem fair. His dad needed them. He needed something that would make his injuries heal, but more than that. He needed something to regenerate what he had lost. He bit his lip as he thought. There was something. What is it? Tomura demanded. Something in one of your games, Izuku told the teen. One of the older games about a character you really hated to fight. Tomura rolled his eyes. The description was too vague. It was one of the re-releases, Izuku remembered more. Not but. It had old characters in it. Fictional ones, but they had quirks. The teen frowned as he thought through the games he had played. Something finally clicked. You mean the little shit who had regeneration? He asked. Izuku nodded. What about those quirks? How rare are they? He remembered Setsuna's quirk allowed her to regenerate parts of herself, but that wasn't quite what they were after. No idea, Tomura admitted. He then grinned. But we can find out. If it would help his dad, they would find out. Izuku smiled. He still felt worried. He still felt sick, but maybe, just maybe there was a way he could help. He held on to that. Tomura insisted they have pizza for dinner, and since he had the credit card, Izuku was forced to go along with it. He'd have preferred katsudon, but the teen would not order that. Dinner didn't fit into Kurogiri's more nutritious category, but Izuku figured that was Tomura's problem. After they'd eaten, and cleaned up as best they could, the dust was just not shifting from some of the corners in the kitchen, and under the benches was a disaster Izuku didn't want to think about. Tomura dragged him down to the closed bar. He set up his console and then shoved the keyboard at Izuku. You do the searches, the teen commanded. Izuku frowned. What are we searching for? He asked, confused. Regeneration quirks, the older boy told him as if he was stupid. I don't think they will be on the net. Izuku objected. We can at least confirm if they exist. Tomura was defensive. Izuku nodded. That was true. He began typing. Regeneration quirk. Is that how you spell it? Tomura asked. The freckled boy didn't know, but he hit search anyway. A whole heap of results came up, but none of them looked to be what he wanted. They definitely weren't in Japanese. Izuku tapped translate. Turkish? Tomura growled. Would you recognize the word? Izuku asked. He was acutely aware that he was the one who went to school. The teen didn't answer. Izuku typed more attempts into the search and eventually it suggested something that looked right. He hit search. A Kiwi page came up as the first result. It had a picture of a starfish on it. It looked like a spider with fat legs. We don't want that, Tomura dismissed it. Maybe, Izuku agreed. But it beats the next result, he pointed out. That was a news article with a headline, Regeneration Quirks, Fact or Fiction? TCH, the teen replied. It was practically an instruction to look at the Kiwi site. Izuku clicked. The Kiwi site was for biology and the picture of the starfish showed it regrowing legs. There was, however, a supplementary link at the top for regeneration quirk, and Izuku beamed as he clicked it. That took them to another Kiwi page. He read quickly over the introduction, which had him feeling relief. Regeneration quirks did exist. He knew they did on some level since Setsuna's quirk allowed her to regenerate parts of her body, but he hadn't been sure how rare they were. Or how encompassing they could be. Less rare than healing quirks, Tomura said, obviously reading more quickly than Izuku could. But only by a small amount. How powerful are they? Izuku asked, scrolling down. There was usually some sort of scale cobbled together on these pages. The major delineations of quirks were mutant, emitter and transformer, but under those definitions there was lots of variety. Healing quirks were usually emitter type, but regeneration quirks were classified as mutant type. Izuku didn't care what type they were, so long as he could borrow it to give to his dad. He found the image of the scales. Against the usual measure of strength, regeneration scored poorly, but there was a note that since regeneration should repair torn muscle fibers, it would be possible to use it to train to become as strong as humanly possible. By all the usual measures, regeneration was a very selfish quirk type in that it only affected the user. Izuku could see lots of uses for it, and he wondered why no one who had a regeneration-style quirk was a hero. How useful would it be to know that you wouldn't get hurt badly? Izuku shook his head. He wasn't going to think about heroes. He had to find out how to get a regeneration quirk. Setsuna's wouldn't do his dad any good, at least not while he was unconscious. It had to be another one. He needed more information. Information. Izuku jerked up. What is it? Tomura demanded when the younger boy stopped scrolling the page. We need information, Izuku told him. Dad, he thought about the words. Dad had a broker, Izuku recalled from last year when he was suspended. Kurogiri talks to him all the time. Giran, Tomura shrugged. No, this was someone else. Nasuto, Izuku told the teen. He is Dad's information broker. He can help us find someone with a regeneration quirk. He smiled, and for the first time since Kurogiri had taken them to see his dad, Izuku felt like there was something he could really do. He'd need help with it, but he knew you didn't have to do everything yourself. Can you contact him? Tomura asked. Izuku nodded. He had Nasuto's phone number and he jumped up to get his phone. There was no time to lose. Sir Night-Eye rested his elbows on the table, braiding his fingers together in front of his nose as he leaned forward. The Hero Public Safety Commission was meeting, and while heroes were not usually a part of the meeting, the events were of such significance that as All Might's only sidekick, he had been invited to attend. There were several other people who would not usually attend as well. Mostly government officials who were waiting to be told what the hell had gone on. So far, we've pulled out over 300 dead. There's still 800 missing and unaccounted for, however several of the search heroes indicate they can account for approximately 500 of those. Thankfully, the vast majority have been safe thanks to most of the buildings adhering to code. Mirai nodded, as did most of the table. The building code was one of the things that people both hated and loved. Hated because it cost more to build to it, but loved because in situations like this it saved lives. Buildings didn't just collapse these days, and if they did, there were safer places to be in them where they were designed to create air pockets. You might have to wait for rescue, but you would be, theoretically, unharmed. Of the dead, we are still working to identify 14. As he listened, Sir Night-Eye slid one of the briefing reports to him and read through it. He was here to provide information on the villain, All for One, but also to help come up with the cover story. As expected, the Hero Public Safety Commission and government hadn't settled on one, and he had to make absolutely sure they didn't settle on telling the truth. That would cause far more problems than it would solve, yet they probably believed it would be best. The names of the dead and missing were prominent in the report. It was a media gesture. These reports, bits of them, were given to the public. It looked good for the image that the dead and missing were the first things read. It made it seem like they cared. They didn't, but they were at least practiced in that way in maintaining their image. He cast his eyes down the names and resisted the urge to snort. Hisashi Rigi was listed as missing. Apparently they sucked at identifying bodies. He'd have to go do that for them after this meeting. Interestingly though, there was another name he recognized. Nasuto Seiki. He was an information broker in the underworld. Some said he was the information broker. Mirai didn't think it was any coincidence that he'd been in the area. It just confirmed his link to All for One, though he wondered if Nasuto had any effects which had been collected from his body. They would be useful in tracking down others, because while the head had been cut from the serpent, he was not naive enough to think it would die. It wouldn't die, and it wouldn't become a hydra or a phoenix, but it would probably become a whole lot of little annoying lizards. Sir Night-Eye added to his mental note that when he went to identify Hisashi that he at least got a look at Nasuto's effects. Rebuilding has begun and Cementos has come down to assist with the efforts. The hero was a relatively popular one, but a good choice when it came to rebuilding quickly. With his control over cement, they could recycle in situ many of the components, though the steel would have to be reforged. But the media are still hounding us for an explanation, the speaker concluded. That was his cue to start paying proper attention, and Sir Night-Eye folded the report closed. I don't see why we just can't tell them the truth but place emphasis on the fact that All Might won and survived, one enlightened individual said. What truth? We don't even know who that villain was. Someone objected. Mirai's expression didn't change, but he saw the commissioner shake his head slightly. He felt relieved at that. The government knew who the villain was, but they didn't want to make it public. He would still go to identify the body, but only as Hisashi Rigi, not as All for One. They may be more on top of this than he realized. However, telling the truth was not a suggestion that could be allowed, and thankfully another of them spoke up. You want to let the public know that a villain, who has almost killed All Might himself, came out of nowhere? The new speaker shook her head theatrically. It won't be long before everyone is suspected of being a villain. That was probably going too far, but her point was well made. All for One relied on hiding in plain sight. The thought that someone like that could be amongst them would panic the masses. They liked the thought that villains were someone who didn't fit, who weren't normal, and who hid in dingy alleyways and backstreet bars. The public wouldn't like the fact that All for One was taken out in a respectable business area. They would hate the fact that the unnamed Hisashi Rigi had been one of the most dangerous men in the world, had controlled a vast criminal empire, all while whining and dining the elite of society as the respected owner and director of would not sit right because the damage was far more than a white-collar crime. The damage and death was worthy of a true villain. The question, I believe, is who we blame this on, the commissioner said, smoothly taking control. Sir Night-Eye liked the man. He tried to be truthful, but recognized that society could only handle so much truth before it cracked, but he also tried to keep the lies simple. A substitution here, a day altered there. It made things easier to keep straight. What major villains have been taken down recently? He asked. Mirai had spent some time this morning looking for the answer to that exact question. As far as he could tell, there was only one villain that fit the bill. Toxic Chainsaw. The villain had a large enough reputation that the public would know the name, and know that violence and death was associated with that name. And Toxic Chainsaw had been taken out primarily by the underground hero Scarab, working in concert with the rookie Eraserhead. There were a few others involved peripherally, but the actual confrontation had been those two. So long as they got the pay, the two of them would most likely be pleased at the lack of attention. They would also think the number one hero was showboating, but someone from the would explain it to them. Or enough of the situation that they understood. "See, Lord?" someone suggested. The commissioner suddenly looked as tired as Sir Night-Eye felt. "Someone not plastered all over the media," he added what should have been an obvious stipulation. The meeting was silent. Mirai hadn't expected the ministers to know anything, but he had expected those from the to at least have some idea. Did they not read the reports Hero sent in? "I believe Toxic Chainsaw is the only villain with enough reputation and a sufficiently quiet arrest," Sir Night-Eye spoke to the table. Most seemed surprised to see him. Heroes, even sidekicks, were not usually invited to these meetings. It was one of the ways they kept control and the same reason heroes were not allowed to be members of the, but this was an unusual situation. They were required to work together to smooth this incident for the public. Mirai watched as the commissioner thought about it. He at least had recognized the villain's name immediately. Eventually he nodded. "Yes, I believe the underground heroes would be pleased to have someone take the credit," he concluded. Mirai detected the slightest hint of sarcasm from him. There was history with one of the underground heroes. The sidekick had no doubt they would keep their mouths shut, but he now knew one of them would not think highly of Toshinori with the cover-up. Good to know. He rose, which brought the eyes of everyone to him. "I'll make sure our agency works on a release to that effect," he told the room. "It will, of course, be sent to you for approval," Mirai added before someone could object. The commissioner nodded, which was both acceptance and dismissal, and Mirai showed himself out. He couldn't solve all their problems and he had a body to identify. End chapters 42 and 43, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.